Adrian Holloway built a billion-dollar tech empire. But the truth was, he didn't build it alone. For 14 years, his wife Natalie helped keep the company alive through bankrupt investors, legal threats, and sleepless nights. Then one day, she discovered something terrifying. According to the company's official records, she had never been part of it at all. Her name had been removed, her role rewritten. And the woman now standing beside Adrian, his new strategist, Vanessa Carlisle, seemed to be stepping perfectly into the life Natalie once had. But what Adrian didn't realize was that the woman he trusted most had already started taking control of the company itself. Silicon Valley had learned to admire Adrian Holloway long before most people understood what his company actually did. To the public, he was the kind of entrepreneur that headlines were built around: charismatic, calm under pressure, and endlessly confident about the future of artificial intelligence. Investors described him as visionary. Employees called him brilliant. Journalists liked to repeat the same phrase whenever they wrote about him: the man who built Holloway Dynamics from nothing into one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. What very few people talked about, at least not publicly anymore, was how fragile that beginning had once been. 14 years earlier, the company did not exist as a polished corporate powerhouse. It was little more than an idea, a laptop, and a cramped apartment that smelled permanently of burned coffee and sleepless nights. Adrian spent those days writing code and chasing impossible prototypes, convinced that one day machines would learn patterns faster than humans could imagine. But while Adrian designed the technology, someone else quietly kept the entire dream alive. Natalie Holloway. Natalie had never cared about public recognition. She was practical where Adrian was ambitious, steady where he was restless. When the company was nothing more than a risky experiment, she handled the things that Adrian barely noticed: investor emails, budget spreadsheets, negotiation calls with early suppliers. When the startup nearly collapsed during its first year, it was Natalie who convinced their only angel investor not to pull out. Many of the earliest employees knew the truth even if the outside world never did. Adrian may have been the visionary mind, but Natalie had been the one who kept the entire operation from falling apart. In those early days, the company functioned like a fragile ecosystem. Adrian worked endlessly on innovation, often disappearing into technical problems for days at a time, while Natalie quietly solved the practical crises that appeared almost every week. When the company faced its first legal complication, Natalie negotiated the settlement. When investors demanded proof of financial stability, Natalie prepared the projections that convinced them to stay. Those who worked there often joked that Holloway Dynamics had two founders, one who built the technology, and one who made sure the company survived long enough to matter. But history has a strange way of simplifying complicated stories. 14 years later, Holloway Dynamics was no longer a fragile startup. It was a multi-billion-dollar corporation with international offices, thousands of employees, and investors who treated Adrian Holloway like a symbol of modern American innovation. His interviews appeared everywhere: business channels, technology conferences, leadership podcasts. He spoke confidently about the future of artificial intelligence and the responsibility of those who built it. Somewhere along the way, Natalie had slowly disappeared from those conversations. At first, the change was subtle. Adrian began attending corporate events without her. Investor dinners that once included Natalie became private meetings between Adrian and his executive team. Press interviews stopped mentioning the early days of the company entirely, focusing instead on Adrian's vision and the company's explosive growth. Around the same time, another name began appearing beside Adrian more frequently: Vanessa Carlisle. Vanessa had been hired as a public relations strategist during a critical phase of the company's expansion. She was sharp, composed, and remarkably skilled at shaping public narratives. Within months, she became one of Adrian's closest professional advisors. Investors liked her confidence. Journalists appreciated how easily she could frame complex corporate strategies into compelling stories. Soon, Vanessa was attending nearly every major meeting with Adrian. Inside the company, people began noticing subtle cultural shifts. Vanessa's influence expanded quickly. She helped Adrian restructure several communication departments, reorganize public messaging, and redefine the company's external brand identity. Her ideas often seemed bold and ambitious, and Adrian trusted her judgment more with every passing month. Meanwhile, Natalie noticed something far less encouraging. Adrian had started becoming distant. Conversations about the company that once happened naturally between them now ended quickly. Adrian appeared distracted whenever Natalie asked about new corporate decisions. Several board meetings took place without her knowledge, even though she had once been deeply involved in the company's earliest strategic discussions. At first, Natalie assumed the changes were simply part of the company's rapid growth. Large corporations required different structures than fragile startups. But then something strange happened. One afternoon, Natalie received a message from an old employee who had worked with them during the earliest days of Holloway Dynamics. The message was short, almost hesitant. "Hey! I just saw the company website update. Why did they remove you from the founder page?" Natalie stared at the message longer than she expected. Remove her? That made no sense. Curious and slightly confused, she opened the company website and navigated to the corporate history section. The page looked polished and professional, filled with sleek graphics and carefully written timelines about the company's development. But something immediately felt wrong. The founding story described Adrian Holloway as the sole visionary behind the company. The narrative explained how Adrian had developed the technology, launched the startup, and guided it toward becoming a global leader in artificial intelligence. Natalie read the page again slowly. Her name was nowhere on it. At first, she assumed it must be a mistake. Corporate websites were updated constantly. Someone in marketing might have accidentally simplified the company history. But as Natalie continued reading, a deeper unease settled into her chest. The entire story had been rewritten. Not just simplified. Rewritten. According to the official company narrative, Adrian had built Holloway Dynamics entirely on his own. Natalie closed the website and opened the internal company filings. Those documents told the same story. Carefully, quietly, Natalie opened the state corporate registry records, the official legal documents that defined the company's founding structure. What she found there stopped her breathing for a moment. According to the legal record, Holloway Dynamics had only ever had one founder. Adrian Holloway. Natalie stared at the screen, the quiet glow of the document reflecting in her eyes. Legally speaking, it was as if she had never been part of the company at all. The deeper Natalie Holloway looked into the company's records, the more unsettling the truth began to feel. At first, she had convinced herself there must be some administrative mistake. Large corporations constantly updated filings, revised corporate language, and simplified their public histories. It was possible that someone in the legal department had made an error while restructuring documents. But something about the way her name had vanished felt too deliberate to be accidental. The next morning, Natalie scheduled a meeting with a corporate attorney named Ethan Mercer. Ethan had built his reputation in Silicon Valley by navigating complicated corporate disputes, the kind that involved millions of dollars and reputations that could collapse overnight. He was known for being calm, methodical, and brutally honest with his clients. Natalie arrived at his office carrying a folder of documents she had printed from the corporate registry database. She placed them carefully on Ethan's desk while explaining what she had discovered. Ethan listened quietly without interrupting. His expression remained neutral as he began reviewing the filings one by one. The room remained silent except for the soft turning of paper. After several minutes, Ethan leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "These documents weren't changed recently," he said slowly. "They were amended months ago." Natalie frowned. "Months ago?" Ethan nodded and pointed to a section of the filing history. "Your husband's legal team submitted a series of amendments to the company's founding documents. They revised the official origin structure of Holloway Dynamics." Natalie felt a slow tension forming in her chest. "What does that mean exactly?" Ethan slid one of the documents across the desk toward her. It means that according to the state registry, Adrian Holloway is the sole founder of the company. Natalie stared at the line of text that defined the company's founding structure. It was written in the precise language lawyers preferred: technical, clean, and strangely emotionless. But its meaning was unmistakable. She was not part of the record. Natalie looked back at Ethan. That's not possible. I helped build that company from the beginning. Ethan nodded calmly. I'm not questioning that. I'm explaining what the legal documents say. He opened another folder and pointed to the amendment history. These changes were filed almost 8 months ago. They restructured the company's founding narrative and removed any shared ownership implications. Natalie felt something heavier than anger settling inside her. 8 months ago, she repeated quietly. That meant Adrian had been rewriting the company's legal history while they were still living together, still married, still sharing the same home. Ethan watched her carefully before speaking again. You should understand something important. Legally speaking, these amendments complicate things significantly. If you were never listed as an official founder or shareholder in the original filings, proving ownership now becomes extremely difficult. Natalie closed the folder slowly. So he planned this. Ethan didn't answer directly. His silence was careful, professional. But it was answer enough. That evening Natalie returned to the penthouse apartment she shared with Adrian. The city lights outside the tall glass windows stretched across the skyline like a distant constellation. It was the same view they had once celebrated when the company signed its first major investment deal. Tonight the apartment felt strangely unfamiliar. Adrian was sitting near the living room window reviewing something on his tablet. He looked up when Natalie entered but showed little surprise. You're home early, he said casually. Natalie walked toward him slowly, holding the printed documents in her hand. I spoke with a corporate attorney today. Adrian's expression barely changed. About what? Natalie placed the documents on the table between them. About the amendments filed to Holloway Dynamics 8 months ago. Adrian glanced down at the papers for a brief moment before leaning back in his chair. The silence stretched between them. You removed me from the company's founding documents, Natalie said. Adrian's voice remained calm. The company needed a cleaner corporate structure. Natalie studied his face carefully. There was no guilt in his expression, no hesitation. So you erased me from the story? Adrian looked directly at her. You were never officially part of it. The words hung in the room with a cold finality. Natalie felt a strange clarity forming inside her. The man sitting in front of her looked familiar, yet something essential about him felt completely different. This wasn't the ambitious entrepreneur who once celebrated small victories with her in their cramped apartment. This was someone far more calculated. Adrian stood and walked toward the kitchen counter as if the conversation were already finished. There's another thing we should discuss, he said without looking at her. Natalie waited. I've asked my lawyers to prepare divorce papers. The words landed quietly, almost casually. Natalie didn't respond immediately. She simply watched Adrian as he poured himself a glass of water. How long have you been planning that? She asked. Adrian took a slow sip before answering. For a while. Natalie noticed something else then, a subtle detail that made the entire situation feel even more deliberate. Vanessa Carlisle's name appeared on Adrian's tablet screen when a notification appeared. A message preview flashed briefly before disappearing. Natalie had seen Vanessa's presence growing in Adrian's life for months now. Investor dinners, corporate conferences, private strategy meetings. Vanessa had gradually moved closer to the center of Adrian's world while Natalie had quietly drifted toward the edges. News articles had already begun describing Vanessa as Adrian's brilliant strategic advisor, the woman helping guide the company into its next phase of expansion. Natalie suddenly wondered whether the idea to erase her had truly been Adrian's. Or someone else's. The thought settled quietly in her mind. Adrian finished his drink and walked toward the hallway without continuing the conversation. "We'll talk more once the lawyers finalize everything," he said. Natalie remained standing near the window long after he left the room. The pain of betrayal was sharp, but something else was beginning to replace it. Determination. The next morning a courier arrived at the penthouse door. Natalie opened the envelope and slowly unfolded the legal documents inside. Divorce papers. Attached to them was a financial settlement proposal. Natalie read through the pages carefully. The settlement acknowledged their marriage, their shared property, and several investment accounts. But there was one thing it did not mention at all. Holloway Dynamics. According to the documents Adrian's lawyers had prepared, Natalie had never played any role in building the company that was now worth billions. As Natalie Holloway slowly disappeared from the official history of Holloway Dynamics, another presence began to dominate the company's future. Vanessa Carlisle had once entered the company as a public relations strategist, hired during a period when the company was expanding rapidly and facing growing media attention. At the time her role seemed straightforward: manage public messaging, strengthen investor confidence, and shape the company's image during its transformation into a global technology brand. But Vanessa Carlisle was not the type of person who remained quietly in the background. Within months of her arrival, her influence inside the company began expanding in ways that surprised many of the senior executives. She attended high-level strategy meetings that typically involved only the board and top leadership. Her suggestions during investor presentations started shaping the company's broader vision. Gradually, her voice began appearing in places where it had never been expected before, and Adrian Holloway seemed completely comfortable with it. In fact, Adrian appeared increasingly captivated by Vanessa's ideas. She had a rare ability to frame complex corporate strategies in ways that made them sound bold and inevitable at the same time. Investors found her confident explanations reassuring. Journalists found her articulate and precise. She spoke about the future of Holloway Dynamics as if she had always been part of its foundation. Soon it became difficult to see Adrian at any major event without Vanessa standing beside him. Investor dinners, technology conferences, media interviews, Vanessa was present at nearly all of them. She spoke with the same confidence as someone who had helped build the company from the beginning. To outside observers, the pairing appeared natural, even strategic. Many journalists began describing Vanessa as Adrian's closest advisor. Some articles went even further. They started calling her the architect of Adrian's next phase. Inside the company, however, the rapid shift in power was not as comfortable as it appeared from the outside. Several longtime employees quietly noticed the change in atmosphere. Executives who had worked at Holloway Dynamics since its fragile startup days began feeling that the company was slowly becoming something unfamiliar. Vanessa's presence in strategic meetings was no longer occasional. It was expected. Her opinions carried weight, sometimes even more than those of executives who had been part of the company for years. Adrian seemed to trust her judgment completely, often asking for her perspective before making important decisions. Some employees whispered privately that Vanessa's influence had grown unusually fast, but none of them said those concerns out loud. Meanwhile, Natalie was facing a very different reality. The divorce papers had forced her to confront something she had tried to avoid accepting. Adrian had carefully prepared the legal and corporate changes that erased her from the company's story. That kind of planning required time, strategy, and intention. It was not an impulsive decision. For several days Natalie struggled with the emotional weight of the situation. The company had been part of her life for more than a decade. Every early risk, every sleepless night, every uncertain negotiation with investors had shaped the foundation of Holloway Dynamics. Now it felt as if those years had been quietly deleted, but Natalie was not someone who surrendered easily. Instead of responding emotionally, she began studying the company's legal records more carefully. She reviewed historical filings, investment structures, shareholder changes, and corporate amendments. If Adrian had rewritten the company's history, she wanted to understand exactly how it had been done. During that process, Natalie realized something important. The amendments removing her from the company's founding record were only part of a much larger restructuring. That realization led her to contact someone with a very different skill set from corporate attorneys. His name was Caleb Rhodes. Caleb was known in financial investigation circles as someone who could uncover patterns hidden inside complicated financial systems. He specialized in forensic accounting, the careful tracing of money through networks of companies and investment structures that often existed specifically to hide ownership. Natalie met Caleb in a quiet office building far from the corporate headquarters of Holloway Dynamics. She explained the situation carefully, focusing less on her personal betrayal and more on the structural changes she had discovered. Caleb listened attentively while reviewing the documents she had brought. "I'm not interested in the divorce," he said calmly after studying the filings. "What interests me is the financial structure that appeared after those amendments." Natalie leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" Caleb turned his laptop toward her. "These new holding companies," he explained. "They started appearing in the company's investment network around the same time your name disappeared from the founding documents." Natalie studied the screen. Several corporate entities were listed as partial partners in different investment vehicles connected to Holloway Dynamics. At first glance they looked like ordinary financial partners, but Caleb continued examining the records over the next several days. He traced the ownership chains behind those companies, following the legal pathways through multiple registration systems. It was slow, methodical work that required patience and precision. After 3 days Caleb called Natalie and asked her to meet again. This time his expression carried a quiet seriousness. "I found something interesting," he said. Natalie sat across from him, waiting. "These holding companies are connected to the same controlling entity." Natalie felt a slight tension returning. "And who controls that entity?" she asked. Caleb tapped a key on his laptop and turned the screen toward her. The name appeared clearly in the ownership record, Vanessa Carlisle. Natalie stared at the document for several seconds. Caleb continued explaining the structure. The holding companies were designed to look independent, but their financial pathways ultimately traced back to entities managed by Vanessa. The structure allowed money to move quietly between corporate layers without attracting immediate attention. "What kind of money are we talking about?" Natalie asked quietly. Caleb leaned back in his chair. "Enough to matter." Natalie felt the pieces beginning to form a much darker picture. Vanessa's rise inside the company was not simply professional. It might have been strategic. Caleb opened another document and pointed to a series of recent financial transfers. "These transactions happened over the past 6 months," he said. "And they're all connected to the same network of holding companies." Natalie studied the numbers carefully. The amounts were not small. Millions of dollars had been transferred from Holloway Dynamics into corporate entities controlled through Vanessa's financial structure. The room felt suddenly very quiet. Natalie slowly looked back at Caleb. "What does that mean?" Caleb closed the file and spoke carefully. "It means the woman who replaced you in Adrian's life may also be quietly positioning herself inside the company's financial structure." Natalie's thoughts settled into a single unsettling conclusion. Vanessa Carlisle had not simply stepped into the spotlight beside Adrian Holloway, she had been building something much larger behind it. And according to the financial records Caleb had just uncovered, millions of dollars from Holloway Dynamics were now sitting inside companies controlled by Vanessa herself. The discovery Caleb Rhodes had made did not feel like a simple financial irregularity. The pattern behind the transaction suggested something far more deliberate. Over the next several days he continued studying the financial pathways connected to Holloway Dynamics, tracing ownership structures that stretched across multiple jurisdictions and corporate registrations. Each layer revealed another carefully placed company, another quiet transfer, another strategic shift of assets that seemed invisible unless someone was looking for it. Natalie met Caleb again in the same quiet office where their first conversation had taken place. The calm expression on Caleb's face suggested he had spent many long hours examining the data. "What you're looking at isn't random," he explained while opening a complex chart on his laptop. "Every transfer follows the same pattern." Natalie leaned forward, studying the diagram. Lines connected different corporations in a chain of ownership that extended far beyond Holloway Dynamics. Each company appeared legitimate on the surface, registered with proper documentation and operating under normal business categories. But Caleb had begun tracing their deeper ownership. "They're shell corporations," he said. "They exist mainly to move assets quietly." Natalie watched as Caleb followed the lines of ownership from one entity to another. "All of them eventually lead back to the same controlling structure," he continued. "And that structure is tied to Vanessa Carlisle." The realization felt heavier this time. Natalie had suspected Vanessa's involvement since the moment she discovered the financial transfers. But seeing the full architecture of the system made it impossible to ignore how carefully everything had been planned. Vanessa hadn't simply entered Adrian's life as a strategist or advisor. She had been building a financial network inside the company. Caleb zoomed in on another set of records. These transactions aren't just about money, he explained. They're about influence. Natalie frowned slightly. What kind of influence? Control. The word lingered in the air between them. According to Caleb's analysis, the financial transfers were not random investments. They were strategically designed to accumulate indirect influence over certain corporate assets. By placing those assets inside controlled holding companies, Vanessa was gradually positioning herself within the company's deeper financial structure. It was a slow strategy, almost invisible unless someone understood how corporate ownership networks functioned. Natalie sat quietly, absorbing the implications. Adrian doesn't know about this, she said. Caleb looked at her carefully before answering. I don't see any evidence that he does. At Holloway Dynamics, the atmosphere inside the executive leadership had also begun shifting. Several senior executives who had worked with Adrian for years had recently resigned. Their departures had been explained publicly as personal career decisions or opportunities elsewhere. But when Natalie began speaking privately with a few of them, a different explanation emerged. Vanessa Carlyle. Her influence inside the company had become difficult to challenge. She participated in strategic planning discussions, advised Adrian on corporate messaging, and frequently recommended structural changes to improve what she called operational efficiency. Some executives had quietly felt pushed aside. Others simply decided it was easier to leave. Adrian, however, seemed completely comfortable with the transformation. From the outside, his partnership with Vanessa looked natural, even productive. Together they presented the image of a confident leadership team guiding Holloway Dynamics into a powerful new phase of growth. Vanessa's intelligence impressed investors. Her strategic confidence strengthened the company's public image. She appeared to be everything a rapidly expanding technology empire might need. But Natalie now understood that the real strategy was unfolding behind those appearances. Caleb showed her another set of documents that had been filed recently within the company's internal structure. These are restructuring agreements Adrian signed about 2 months ago, he explained. Natalie studied the pages carefully. The language described a complex internal reorganization designed to protect Holloway Dynamics from potential investor pressure during future funding rounds. At first glance, the document seemed harmless, even logical. But Caleb pointed to several clauses buried deep in the legal text. These provisions shift certain voting rights through intermediate entities, he said. Those entities connect to the same holding companies Vanessa controls. Natalie looked back at him slowly. You're saying Adrian signed these? Caleb nodded. It looks that way. Natalie felt a quiet mixture of disbelief and understanding forming inside her. Adrian had always been focused on innovation and growth, often leaving legal details to advisors he trusted. Vanessa's role as a strategic consultant gave her exactly the kind of access needed to guide those decisions. Adrian likely believed he was strengthening the company. In reality, he might have been surrendering pieces of it. Natalie stood near the window of Caleb's office for several moments, watching the distant traffic moving through the city below. The situation now presented her with a difficult choice. Adrian had betrayed her in the most calculated way possible. He had erased her from the company she helped build and prepared divorce papers that treated her contributions as if they had never existed. Part of her felt that whatever consequences followed were simply the result of his own decisions. But another part of her remembered the early days of Holloway Dynamics, the long nights, the fragile risks, the shared belief that the company represented something meaningful. Allowing Vanessa to quietly dismantle that legacy would mean watching the entire foundation collapse. Caleb closed his laptop slowly. There's something else you should know, he said. Natalie turned back toward him. He reopened one final document that contained a summary of share distributions connected to the holding companies. The numbers had been carefully hidden behind multiple layers of ownership, but Caleb had managed to calculate their combined influence. He rotated the screen so Natalie could see the final result. Vanessa Carlisle's controlled entities now possessed a level of voting influence that had not existed months earlier. Natalie stared at the numbers for several seconds. Caleb spoke quietly. "She's almost there." Natalie's voice was calm but tense. "Almost where?" Caleb's answer came without hesitation. "Control." He tapped the final figure on the screen. Based on these numbers, Vanessa now secretly controls enough shares to challenge Adrian's leadership of Holloway Dynamics. The headquarters of Holloway Dynamics stood like a symbol of technological ambition in the center of Silicon Valley. Glass walls reflected the afternoon sunlight, while inside the building a very different kind of tension quietly unfolded. A major board meeting had been scheduled that morning, officially described as a discussion about the company's next stage of global expansion. For most executives, meetings like this were routine. Strategic planning sessions happened frequently in a company that had grown as rapidly as Holloway Dynamics. But this meeting carried a strange sense of anticipation. Adrian Holloway entered the boardroom with his usual confidence. For years he had walked into rooms like this knowing that every major decision ultimately aligned with his vision. Investors trusted him, the board respected him, and the company's extraordinary success reinforced the belief that his leadership was the foundation of everything Holloway Dynamics had become. He took his seat at the long polished table, greeting several board members as they settled into their chairs. The atmosphere seemed professional but slightly quieter than usual. Several familiar executives were missing, replaced by representatives from newer investment groups that had joined the company's financial structure in recent months. Adrian noticed the difference but did not dwell on it. Across the table, Vanessa Carlisle was organizing a series of presentation slides on the large digital screen mounted on the wall. She appeared composed, focused, and completely comfortable in the room. Her role in the meeting had been described as a strategic overview of future corporate restructuring, an idea she had mentioned to Adrian weeks earlier as part of preparing the company for larger international investments. Adrian had approved the concept without hesitation. Vanessa had consistently proven herself capable of presenting complex strategies in ways that impressed both investors and board members. Her presence beside him had gradually become a normal part of the company's leadership dynamic. The meeting began with routine updates. Financial summaries, market projections, and product development timelines were presented quickly. Adrian listened with the calm focus of someone accustomed to navigating corporate discussions. Then Vanessa stood and walked to the front of the room. She activated the presentation screen and displayed a title that read, "Strategic Governance Realignment." Her voice was clear and confident as she began explaining the proposal. Holloway Dynamics is entering a stage where the traditional leadership structure may limit our ability to move quickly in global markets, she said. To maintain competitive flexibility, we need a governance model that distributes operational authority more efficiently. Several board members nodded as she spoke. Vanessa continued outlining a series of structural adjustments that would reorganize decision-making authority across several executive divisions. On the surface, the proposal sounded logical. Companies expanding internationally often required more adaptable leadership structures. But as Vanessa progressed through the presentation, Adrian noticed something unusual. The proposed changes shifted certain voting authorities through committees that did not previously exist. Several newly structured leadership groups would gain approval rights over major strategic decisions. Adrian leaned slightly forward in his chair. The details were technical, but the pattern was beginning to emerge. Vanessa advanced to another slide displaying the new shareholder alignment supporting the restructuring. Several board members who represented newer investment entities voiced their support almost immediately. "This structure gives the company far more agility," one investor remarked. Another added, "It's exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach we need at this stage." Adrian felt a subtle tension building inside him. He glanced around the room, noticing that several board members were studying Vanessa's proposal with expressions that suggested familiarity rather than surprise. This was not the first time they had seen these ideas. Vanessa remained calm as she moved to the final section of her presentation. In order to implement this restructuring effectively, she said, we must also realign certain voting shares within the company's governance framework. Adrian's attention sharpened immediately. The slide displayed a summary of shareholder voting distribution. For a brief moment, the numbers did not fully register. Then the meaning became clear. Several voting blocks that had previously aligned with Adrian's authority were now grouped under a coalition of investment entities connected through the same holding structures Caleb had discovered. Adrian slowly turned his head toward Vanessa. She met his gaze without hesitation. The room remained silent as the implications settled across the board. Adrian spoke carefully. When did these shareholder changes happen? Vanessa's answer was calm. Over the past several months. They were completed through standard investment acquisitions and restructuring agreements. Adrian's mind moved quickly through recent decisions he had approved, the documents Vanessa had recommended he sign to protect the company from aggressive investor pressure. Those agreements suddenly carried a very different meaning. You advised those restructures, Adrian said quietly. Vanessa did not deny it. They were necessary to position the company for its next phase. Several board members shifted slightly in their seats, sensing the tension now forming between the two central figures in the room. Adrian studied the voting distribution again. The numbers were unmistakable. The combined shareholder influence supporting Vanessa's restructuring proposal had grown large enough to challenge his own authority as CEO. Vanessa folded her hands calmly in front of her. For the company to evolve successfully, she continued, leadership must reflect the new shareholder balance. Adrian's voice remained controlled, though the realization behind his eyes had become clear. You've been preparing this. Vanessa did not smile, but her expression carried quiet certainty. Preparation is part of strategy. For the first time since the meeting began, Adrian understood the full scope of what had been unfolding around him. The restructuring proposals, the new investment entities, the legal agreements he had signed, each step had quietly shifted the company's balance of power. And the person guiding those changes had been sitting beside him the entire time. Across the city, Natalie Holloway sat in a quiet office where Caleb Rhodes had informed her that a major board meeting was taking place that afternoon. She did not know exactly what was being discussed inside that room, but she understood enough about Vanessa's strategy to suspect that something decisive was unfolding. Back in the boardroom, the chairman of the board cleared his throat and looked around the table. We've reviewed the proposal, he said. The next step is a formal vote. The electronic voting system appeared on the large screen. Adrian stared at the numbers once more. For the first time since he founded Holloway Dynamics, the outcome of a board vote was no longer under his control. As the board prepared to cast their votes, Adrian realized something he had never expected to face. He might lose the company he created. The hours following the boardroom meeting left Holloway Dynamics in a strange and uneasy silence. Officially, nothing had changed yet. No public announcement had been made, no press release had been issued, and no internal message had reached employees. But within the upper levels of the company, the atmosphere had shifted in ways that everyone could feel. Something fundamental about the balance of power inside the corporation had quietly begun to fracture. Vanessa Carlyle walked through the executive floor that afternoon with the same composed confidence she had always displayed. From the outside, she appeared perfectly calm, almost as if the board meeting had simply confirmed a strategy she had expected all along. Her assistants continued coordinating investor calls, legal teams continued reviewing documents, and Vanessa herself spent most of the day preparing the next stage of the restructuring plan. In her mind, the difficult part was already behind her. The coalition of shareholder influence she had assembled over the previous months had positioned her exactly where she needed to be. The company's governance structure was about to change, and once that process began, it would be extremely difficult for anyone to reverse it. What Vanessa did not know was that another process had already begun far beyond the glass towers of Holloway Dynamics. Natalie Holloway sat quietly inside a federal office building across the city. The room was simple and professional, designed more for careful discussions than dramatic confrontations. Across the table, two federal financial investigators were reviewing the documents Caleb Rhodes had prepared. Caleb had spent days organizing the financial evidence into a clear narrative that traced the movement of money through Vanessa's network of shell corporations. The investigators studied each chart slowly, asking precise questions about transaction timelines, ownership records, and investment pathways. These holding companies are all connected through the same control structure? One investigator asked. Caleb nodded calmly. Yes. Each entity appears independent on paper, but the financial authority ultimately routes through organizations linked to Vanessa Carlyle. The investigator flipped to another page showing a sequence of transfers. And these funds originated from Holloway Dynamics? Correct, Caleb replied. The transfers were structured to appear like investment reallocations. Natalie remained silent while the conversation continued. Her role in the meeting was simple: to explain her connection to the company and provide context for the corporate changes that had taken place over the past year. When one of the investigators finally looked toward her, his tone remained neutral. "Ms. Holloway, why bring this to us now?" Natalie answered calmly. "Because the company I helped build is about to fall under the control of someone who has been quietly moving its assets." The investigator studied her expression for a moment before nodding slowly. "We'll review everything carefully." Outside the building, the city continued moving through its ordinary routines, unaware that the future of one of its largest companies had just become part of a federal financial investigation. Inside Holloway Dynamics, the first signs of instability were beginning to spread. Investors had started asking quiet questions after hearing rumors that the board meeting had been unusually tense. Some executives noticed that several legal advisors were suddenly reviewing corporate governance documents again. The uncertainty had not yet reached employees across the company, but within the leadership circle the tension was unmistakable. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued moving forward with her plans. She arranged several calls with investment partners who supported the restructuring proposal, emphasizing the importance of completing the leadership transition quickly. The faster the changes were implemented, the less opportunity there would be for resistance. Time, in Vanessa's mind, had become the most valuable resource. Adrian Holloway, however, had spent the day thinking about the events of the meeting with increasing clarity. The deeper he considered the situation, the more obvious the pattern became. The legal agreements he had signed months earlier, the investment groups that had quietly appeared in shareholder records, the restructuring proposals Vanessa had encouraged, every step had gradually shifted the company's balance of power. And he had trusted the person guiding those steps. Late that evening, Adrian asked Vanessa to meet him in his private office overlooking the city. She entered the room with her usual calm professionalism. "You wanted to talk?" she asked. Adrian stood near the window for a moment before turning toward her. "You planned this for months." Vanessa did not appear offended by the accusation. "I prepared the company for its next stage," she replied evenly. Adrian studied her expression carefully. "You convinced me to sign those restructuring documents. They were necessary." "For you," Adrian said quietly. Vanessa folded her arms calmly. "For the company." The silence between them carried a strange tension, not the chaos of open conflict, but the quiet recognition that two strategies had collided. Adrian spoke again. "You're trying to take control." Vanessa's answer came without hesitation. "Leadership evolves when companies grow." Adrian watched her closely. There was no anger in her voice, no defensiveness, only confidence. "You really believe you've secured everything," he said. Vanessa held his gaze. "The structure is legal." But at that exact moment, across the city, federal investigators were finishing their first review of the financial evidence Caleb had delivered. The transaction patterns had raised serious questions. Offshore holding structures. Asset transfers tied to internal corporate funds. Ownership pathways that suggested concealed influence over company assets. The investigation moved forward quietly. Back at Holloway Dynamics, Vanessa continued finalizing documents that would push the restructuring proposal toward implementation. She remained convinced that her legal preparation had anticipated every possible obstacle. She believed the company was now positioned exactly where she intended. But early the next morning something unexpected happened. Several unmarked vehicles arrived quietly outside the headquarters of Holloway Dynamics. Federal investigators stepped out and entered the building with calm professionalism. Inside the executive office's assistants looked up in confusion as security quietly guided the investigators toward the corporate legal department. Within minutes, word began spreading through the leadership floor. Federal authorities had arrived. And Vanessa Carlisle's carefully constructed plan was about to face a challenge she had never expected. The arrival of federal investigators at Holloway Dynamics spread through the building with unsettling speed. What had begun as quiet questioning inside the legal department quickly evolved into a wave of cautious concern among executives, analysts, and investors who sensed that something far more serious was unfolding. The company that had once represented innovation and stability was suddenly facing the kind of attention that corporations feared most: a federal financial investigation. Inside a private conference room, investigators carefully reviewed internal financial records alongside the documentation Caleb Rhodes had already provided. The patterns were becoming clearer with each hour. What initially appeared to be complex investment structures were now revealing a deeper design, a network of offshore entities that had quietly accumulated influence while redirecting significant corporate funds. Several of those entities traced directly back to Vanessa Carlisle. The discovery transformed the tone of the investigation. What had started as a review of suspicious transactions now pointed toward possible financial manipulation carried out through carefully layered corporate structures. Investigators requested additional documents from the company's accounting departments, tracing each movement of capital through the network Caleb had identified. Meanwhile, word of the investigation began reaching major investors. Holloway Dynamics had always been considered a stable technology giant, but the suggestion that one of its top strategists might have been moving corporate assets through offshore channels created immediate concern. Private investor calls began taking place throughout the afternoon as financial partners demanded explanations. The media soon followed. At first, the reports were cautious. Several financial journalists mentioned that federal authorities were reviewing corporate records at Holloway Dynamics. The headlines framed the situation as a regulatory inquiry rather than a confirmed scandal. But the story quickly gained momentum as reporters began uncovering pieces of the deeper narrative. Vanessa Carlisle's name appeared in those reports almost immediately. Only weeks earlier she had been praised in business magazines as the strategic mind helping guide Adrian Holloway's company into its next phase of growth. Her confident presence at investor conferences had made her one of the most recognizable figures within the company's leadership circle. Now journalists were asking a very different question. Had that influence been used to quietly redirect corporate assets? Inside the headquarters, the board of directors convened an emergency meeting. The company's reputation was already beginning to suffer, and investors were demanding reassurance that the leadership structure remained stable. After reviewing the preliminary findings presented by legal advisors, the board reached a decision that would have been unthinkable only days earlier. Vanessa Carlisle was removed from all operational authority within Holloway Dynamics until the investigation concluded. The announcement was brief but decisive. Her access to internal financial systems was suspended, and her strategic advisory role was immediately placed on hold. To employees across the company, the message carried a clear implication: something serious had gone wrong. For Adrian Holloway, the moment carried a far deeper weight. Sitting alone in his office that evening, he began reviewing the documents investigators had requested from the company. With each page he read, the pattern that Natalie and Caleb had uncovered became more visible. The holding companies. The investment transfers. The shareholder influence that had gradually shifted the balance of power inside the corporation. Vanessa had not simply positioned herself as a trusted advisor. She had quietly constructed an entire financial network within the company's structure. For the first time, Adrian confronted the full scope of what had happened. His trust in Vanessa had not only reshaped the leadership dynamics of Holloway Dynamics, it had also contributed to the betrayal that destroyed his marriage. Natalie had warned him that something about the changes felt wrong. He had ignored her. Across the city, Natalie followed the unfolding news reports with a calm expression that hid the complicated emotions beneath it. She had not pursued revenge when she brought the financial evidence to investigators. Her intention had been simpler: protect the company she helped build and prevent its quiet takeover. But the public consequences of the investigation were now spreading far beyond the boardroom. Financial news networks began discussing Vanessa Carlyle as the central figure in a rapidly developing corporate scandal. Analysts examined her previous role in the company's restructuring proposals, questioning whether the leadership changes she recommended had been part of a broader strategy. Vanessa responded quickly through her legal team. In a carefully worded statement, she denied any wrongdoing and suggested that the financial transfers had been legitimate investment strategies approved by company leadership. Her attorneys hinted that Adrian Holloway himself had signed several of the restructuring documents now being examined by investigators. The implication was clear. If Vanessa faced legal consequences, Adrian might not escape scrutiny either. For several days, the investigation continued quietly but relentlessly. Financial analysts reviewed thousands of transaction records while investigators examined the ownership structures connecting Vanessa's offshore entities to the company's internal assets. The evidence continued building. Caleb Rhodes' original findings became a central part of the investigative case, providing a clear map of the financial pathways that had allowed the asset transfers to remain hidden for so long. Natalie's testimony about the company's restructuring timeline added further context, helping investigators understand how Vanessa's influence had expanded during the same period the corporate amendments erased Natalie from the company's founding record. The narrative forming inside the investigation was both complex and troubling. A strategist who had entered the company as a trusted advisor now appeared to have constructed a financial system capable of shifting corporate power without immediate detection. Public attention intensified as reporters began piecing together the story. Vanessa Carlyle, once celebrated as the brilliant strategist behind Holloway Dynamics' next era, had become the center of a national corporate scandal. But as the investigation approached its final stage, something unexpected happened. Federal authorities prepared to formally announce financial charges connected to the offshore transactions. Legal teams finalized the documentation necessary to bring the case into public court proceedings. The announcement was scheduled for the following morning. However, when investigators attempted to contact Vanessa Carlyle that evening to inform her legal representatives of the next steps, they encountered an unexpected problem. Vanessa Carlyle could not be located. By the time authorities confirmed her last known movements, it had become clear that she had quietly disappeared the night before the federal charges were set to be announced. The disappearance of Vanessa Carlyle did not last long. For several days, her absence only deepened the uncertainty surrounding the investigation. News outlets speculated about where she might have gone, while federal authorities quietly expanded their search beyond the immediate borders of California. The situation added another layer of drama to a corporate scandal that had already captured national attention. When Vanessa was finally located, the circumstances were almost as calculated as everything else she had done. Authorities found her attempting to board an international flight under a travel arrangement that investigators later described as unusually rushed. The attempt confirmed what many had already begun to suspect: Vanessa had realized that the investigation had moved beyond quiet financial review and was about to turn into formal legal action. Her arrest brought the investigation into a new phase. Within days, federal prosecutors began outlining the case in court filings that described the financial architecture Vanessa had quietly built around Holloway Dynamics. The documents explained how a network of offshore holding companies had been used to redirect corporate funds and accumulate shareholder influence without immediately triggering suspicion. What had once appeared to be a brilliant strategist guiding a company's expansion was now being described as a calculated effort to gain control over a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The courtroom proceedings quickly became a focal point for national media. Business journalists who had once praised Vanessa's leadership now studied the financial records presented by prosecutors with a very different tone. Charts showing the movement of millions of dollars through layered corporate entities were displayed during hearings, each one revealing another piece of the strategy that had nearly shifted control of Holloway Dynamics. At the center of those proceedings stood Adrian Holloway. For the first time since the scandal began, Adrian was required to speak publicly about the events that had unfolded within his company. His testimony was measured and careful, but the weight of the situation was unmistakable. He explained how Vanessa had entered the company as a public relations strategist during a critical expansion phase. He described the strategic recommendations she had made, the restructuring agreements he had approved, and the trust he had placed in her judgment as the company grew. But the courtroom was interested in something else as well. The company's earliest history. During the investigation, several documents had resurfaced that painted a far more accurate picture of Holloway Dynamics' beginning. Emails, financial records, early investment negotiations, and internal communications all confirmed something that had once been widely known among the company's first employees. Natalie Holloway had played a central role in building the company during its most fragile years. Witness testimony from early team members reinforced that truth. Former employees described how Natalie handled investor negotiations, managed financial crises, and supported the company's survival during moments when it had nearly collapsed. For years, those contributions had faded quietly from the company's official narrative. Now they were being discussed openly in federal court. As reporters followed the hearings, the media narrative surrounding the scandal began to change. The focus gradually shifted away from Vanessa Carlyle alone and toward the deeper story behind Holloway Dynamics' origin. Articles began appearing with headlines that described Natalie as the forgotten architect behind the company's earliest success. Journalists interviewed former employees who recalled how essential her leadership had been when the company existed only as a fragile startup operating out of a small apartment. The public story that had once described Adrian as the sole founder began evolving into something more complicated and more truthful. Adrian himself eventually addressed that reality during one of the final court sessions connected to the investigation. Standing before reporters after the hearing, he spoke carefully but with visible sincerity. Natalie's contributions to the early years of Holloway Dynamics were significant, he said. The company would not have survived without her. For many observers, the statement felt like a long overdue acknowledgement. Later that evening, Adrian requested a private meeting with Natalie. They met in a quiet cafe far from the corporate headquarters where their lives had once revolved around the same ambition. The atmosphere between them carried a mixture of familiarity and distance. Adrian spoke first. "I should have said those things years ago," he admitted. Natalie listened quietly. "The company changed everything," Adrian continued. "I lost perspective somewhere along the way." The apology sounded genuine, but Natalie understood something that Adrian was only beginning to realize. Some consequences could not be undone. She responded calmly. "You didn't just lose perspective, Adrian. You rewrote the past." Adrian lowered his gaze slightly, acknowledging the truth in her words. "I can't change what happened," he said. "But I wanted you to know that the truth is finally out there." Natalie looked out the cafe window for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said softly. "It is." Adrian hesitated before asking one final question. "The board would support you returning to the company if you wanted." Natalie considered the idea carefully. For 14 years, Holloway Dynamics had been part of her identity. She had helped build its foundation, fought to keep it alive when it was fragile, and watched it grow into something powerful. But she also understood that returning would mean stepping back into a world shaped by betrayal and ambition. After a quiet moment, she shook her head. "I built that company once," she said. "I don't need to prove it again." Her decision surprised Adrian, but he did not argue. In the weeks that followed, Holloway Dynamics began rebuilding its reputation under careful oversight from the board and new compliance structures. The scandal surrounding Vanessa Carlyle slowly faded from the headlines as the legal process continued. But one part of the story remained. Journalists, historians of the technology industry, and former employees continued discussing the company's early history, the real version of it. And in that story, Natalie Holloway's role was finally impossible to erase. One evening months later, Natalie walked past the headquarters of Holloway Dynamics for the first time since the investigation ended. The glass building still stood as a symbol of ambition and innovation, but it no longer defined her life. She paused briefly before continuing down the sidewalk. The empire she helped build remained behind her. But the truth about its beginning now belonged to the world. And the woman Adrienne Holloway had once tried to erase from history had become the one person the story could never forget. Stories like this remind us how easily truth can be rewritten when power and ambition take control. If this story made you think about loyalty, trust, and the price of success, take a moment to support the channel so more stories like this can reach people who value them. Your support helps these hidden stories continue to be told. And if you believe the truth should never be erased, make sure you stay connected for the next story. Natalie walked away from the empire she helped build, choosing dignity over revenge, while the world finally learned the truth that had been hidden for years. Adrienne kept the company, but the one person who had stood beside him when everything began was gone from his life forever. So here's the question that stays behind after everything is over. If someone helped you build your entire success from the ground up, and one day you had the power to erase them from the story, would you protect the truth, or would you rewrite history to protect yourself?